I may not be able to give equal or and full attention to each of them. Uh, but it bears stating upfront that the category and the concept of void in the philosophical sense of the term is also for Ambedkar a very material category. It appears in his corpus in different forms. When he's writing on Buddhism, it appears in the form of words such as shunya or shunyata or shunyavad, which is the doctrine of emptiness. In English, it appears as emptiness. But the most important appearance of it occurs in Ambedkar's abandoned autobiography, Waiting for a Visa, where he speaks of living in a dungeon once he arrives, once he returns to India. And it's that sense of the dungeon that I will be interested in, even if I directly do not get the time to come to the autobiography as such. I'll start with two framing declarations from Ambedkar. One, from 1916 essay Khas in India. He said, "I may seem hard on Manu, but I'm sure my force is not strong enough to kill his ghost. He lives like a disembodied spirit and is appealed to, and I'm afraid will yet live long." The second framing statement I have is from the 1927 Mahar Satyagraha conference. And here Ambedkar declares, "I have myself come determined to do Satyagraha. I'm not going to change my decision about Satyagraha. And I will advise the same thing to my people. Only thing, I will not force them for it." So in both, force appears as an antithesis to what it is referred to as in the modern political tradition. Force is ubiquitous because it is often seen as synonymous with violence, with power, with institutions, bureaucracy, and so on. Although Hannah Arendt in her post-war work tries to make certain kinds of distinctions, but by and large, force remains a function of violence. One of the most important and original gestures in Ambedkar's moral thinking is the thinking of another force. A force that will be also the non-force, or what I will call, using his works, the potential of the destitute, or a destitutant potential. For too long, too often, and too quickly, Ambedkar's remarkable declaration of a new faith in equality, which he formulates around the Mahar Satyagraha, has been read in its purely humanist egalitarian dimension. In this paper, which retraces the complex trajectory of faith in Ambedkar's critique of violence, beginning with his call to sacrifice in the Mahar speeches of the 1920s, down to the composition of the anti-sacrificial treatise, the Buddha and his Dhamma, in the late 1950s, I argue instead that compressed in this early declaration of faith in equality is an anarchic principle, or better still, a principled anarchy, which a decade later in Annihilation of Caste will come to be attached to the grammar of freedom itself. If one grants Mahar this compressed and intense singularity, then one might argue that the thick weave of political and ethical thought and the untaught has come to be woven there, anticipating the immense labor of four irreconcilable and inseparable treatises that are at this moment still to come. The undelivered articulation of the principle, anchored in an incipient critique of blood in Annihilation of Caste. The unbridled logic of sovereignty rooted at the same time in the passionate and insurrectionary love of politics, Ambedkar's terms, in Thoughts on Pakistan, 1941. Thirdly, the unfinished theorization of war and counter-revolution in the essays on the Gita, organized around a sustained engagement with the Indic logic of truth and secrecy. Indeed, the structure of Indic avoidance and spectrality, of which a young Ambedkar had already written of in Caste in India in 1916. And the recuperation of emptiness or shunyata as the ground of a groundless force. Force as the gift of a placeless void that refuses the mastery and measure of politics in the Buddha and his Dhamma in 1956. To refuse the mastery and measure of politics is to not depoliticize, and that is the burden of Ambedkar's thinking. At stake in each of these works is the tension between freedom and sovereignty, duty and debt. The classic exemplars here are Arjun and Siddhartha. Anarchy and office, faith, and most importantly, atheism. In each, freedom is posited simultaneously as a force that annihilates all norms and rules, every foundation of the that caste is, and in this very destruction of the wrong, constitutes the anarchic essence of responsibility and justice, all Ambedkar's themes. In each, but most strikingly in Mahar, freedom is aligned along and against the moral law and sovereign reason of nationalist satyagraha, which is, satyagraha is at once named, claimed, and disavowed. In each, above all, even as Ambedkar veers towards a neo-Roman conception of politics, his writings marked by a giddy fervor of the French revolutionary heritage, Ambedkar comes close to what might only be called a mystical, if not quite apophatic principle of freedom, one that had already begun as early as 1924 to find its force in his embrace of a triad of voids: placelessness, faithlessness, and namelessness. Of course, in 1924, the three terms he uses are Deshantar, Dharmantar, and Namantar. So there's a conversion here that antar here, or difference, antar, invokes. But I will elsewhere take up the limits of grasping this triad simply on a register of conversion and change. I just want to note here that at stake is not, in these three cases, not autonomy in its positive determinate sense, that is conversion as autonomy, anchored in the reasons and decisions or even transformative will of the self. Instead, at stake here for Ambedkar is precisely the embrace of a selfless non-self, shunyata, the courageous embrace of uncertainty in politics in order to be able to love it truthfully again, Ambedkar's terms. At stake here, I will argue, is the making political of the void as such. It is to this anarchic faith pulsating between war and truth, and this thinking an institution of the principle at the cusp between the unsaid and the unsayable, and as we shall see, the unforgiving and the unforgivable, and that is caste. This deferral and destruction of satyagraha in its very name, one that involves the recovery of an indestructible force, is what is at stake. And this is a force of the minor that must ultimately give itself to the void of non-force, that I suggest we today return. We return to this void not only because Ambedkar thinks it, nor because his thought makes the void its fundamental truth. Indeed, truth, as we shall see, as void, political. We return to it instead in order to be able to speak again of the void that Ambedkar has himself become. A thinker of the inappropriable, who today stands perilously close, or is pushed perilously close, to being appropriated by the monstrous eclecticism of nationalist thought. And yet, it is the minor alone that cannot be appropriated by these measures. As he says in 1939, I'm not a part of the whole, I'm a part apart. It is the minor alone that exists in this void of all relations and sight, all sense and light, and I'm referring here to the autobiography. It is the minor alone, perhaps the untouchable alone, that must therefore mobilize, face Ambedkar, the fundamental freedom of the non-relation. Ambedkar is often seen to be a thinker of relations, of moral relations, social relations. And I'm suggesting that one way to reach this kind of eclecticism that Ambedkar is exposed to is to understand what really is the residual power of that thought. I shall speak today of Ambedkar in whatever time I have as a thinker of this void, and if time remains, Ambedkar as the void. Ambedkar not as an ethicist, of political association and civic sociability, a phenomenologist of moral tactility and democratic tact, which he often calls associated living, following Dewey, a theorist of constituent power and constitutional relations, a critic of untouchability, who approached the figure and the question of touch with the greatest caution. Ambedkar is none of this, all of which he is and he does, but rather Ambedkar is a thinker of the non-relation, a miner of those depths where no touch, no sense, no skin, no faith might have to yield to the gravity of caste anymore. A moral psychologist of refuge and placelessness who seeks the freedom of bodies from the paradoxical servitude of territorial self-determination. An instigator of potential at once in its ineradicable finitude and immeasurable potentiality. A harnesser of force in its inappropriable and destituent potential. And I quote, "Only when his eyes have been opened to the fact that he's but a tiny part of a measureless whole," Ambedkar states subsequently in Buddha or Karl Marx's 1956 essay, only when he begins to realize how impermanent a thing is, in his temporary individuality can even enter upon this narrow path, this narrow passage. In the attempt to think of and eventually arrive at this at once finite and measureless whole, this inappropriable destitution or destituent potential, that which he elsewhere calls also a weak force. He says the untouchables are a weak force. They're weak, but they're a force. And so the challenge is to think what theory of resistance and really dissidence, perhaps even insubordination, is at work here. Ambedkar's thought in this process makes a brief, mysterious, and mystical trespass into a place circumscribed by that sovereign limit of India's non-violent struggle against the empire, Satyagraha. This trespass occurs in and around Mahad in 1927 in a series of writings between November and December of that year, never to occur again. Ambedkar stops using the word Satyagraha after this. And it is here, I believe, that Ambedkar becomes a thinker of equality in the way he thought of it. Equality as incommensurability rather than sameness. Equality as a fundamental non-relation of difference. Equality above all as freedom, including the freedom of thought as one's very being. This is where I think the entire creative intensity of Ambedkar as a thinker resides, in his idea that equality alone is freedom, which none of the thinkers of his time within the anti-colonial tradition are actually willing to even entertain, let alone. The militancy to which he comes through this lucid expression of faith in equality. The militancy of this faith resides neither in its militant apostasy against sovereignty, including the sovereignty of God, I'll come to that in a moment, nor in its radical atheism of especially the secularist variety. It resides instead in its renunciation of all economies of perjury and pardon, gift and forgiveness, through which sovereignty inscribes its presence, indeed its transcendence at the heart of moral relations. There would be, says Ambedkar, no pardonable offense in Mahad. There would simply be the ability and willingness to face the void, the abyss of truth and right. Truth as right. And we know that right is not always truthful. But he says, and because truth is not always right, Ambedkar warns, Mahad might henceforth be unforgivable. And if you look at post-colonial historiography, Mahad is just one episode that is completely overshadowed by, as Philip was saying, the Pune Pact and other such hagiographic moments. And I quote Ambedkar here from his speech from Mahad. Satyagraha is a difficult test of persistence. You will have to observe very strong restraint on yourself while suffering the difficulty in Satyagraha. We are willingly offering our lives to others. You will not be allowed to carry sticks to the Satyagraha place. You will not be allowed to disobey any order of the government officers. None of you should ask for pardon if arrested during Satyagraha. You must keep saying till the end that whatever you have done is right. You must strictly follow these rules. Then alone can you participate in Satyagraha. Do not join the movement because I'm telling you, our fight is for justice. If you are convinced and you are ready for facing the troubles and difficulties, then alone join the Satyagraha. What occurs in Mahar is not simply, end of quote. What occurs in Mahar is not simply the institution of the egalitarian principle or the inscription of the social question in nationalist politics in the fundamental Arendtian sense of these terms. What occurs in Mahar instead, and this is what makes Mahar insurrectionary, is a struggle to posit the thinking of equality as inseparable from the principled act of living an equal life. That is to say, the very thought of equality, the freedom to engage in thinking, no less than demanding an unsegregated dwelling or fresh water, is now a force mounted against the juridical ghost and spirit of inequality. One resists the ghosts first and foremost, perhaps only in and by the thought of force, says a young Ambedkar in one of his graduate seminars. But more crucial to this positing is that constitutively, beyond the Greek partition of the sensible and the intelligible, hand and soul, matter and form, living and spectral, there is no force that is also not a thinking, a positing proper of force. So much so that the positing of the egalitarian principle, while it is henceforth rendered inalienable from the force of being equal, and which, the moment the Manusmriti is burnt, exceeds this moral ontology and becomes a performative coup de force to boot, can now, precisely for that reason, exist all by itself. Precisely because you cannot think of equality without living an equal life. That force becomes ontological, it becomes itself and can exist all by itself. This is the ontological distinction between the being of force and the being of violence. So in thinking of force, which appears in Ambedkar in various configurations, there is a critique of violence. That's the broader argument I'm making. But I suspect I'll not get fully to the Buddhism. But let's stay with Mahar, and the point I'm making is that it is the ontological distinction between the being of force and the being of violence, which is also a phenomenological difference between being forceful and being violent. You can be forceful without being violent. The point also of greatest affinity and distance between Ambedkar's and Benjamin's critique of sovereignty. Walter Benjamin's violence preserves itself in order to preserve the law. Ambedkar's force retains its moral calculus and its incalculability in its very vanishing. Force must disappear, he says. Benjamin's violence takes justice to be its task assigned by the divine. Ambedkar's force takes justice to just be, rooted in a forgiveness without apology, a touch without tact, for this touch will involve God, and a theism without atheism. And I'll quote here that decisive passage from the Mahar lectures. The untouchables have the same reason for demanding the right to worship God in the same temple. And he's saying, I don't want to believe in this God you're worshipping. It's the question of truth as right. The untouchables have the same reason for demanding the right to worship God in the same temple. They want to prove that the temple is not defiled by their entry. Neither is the sanctity of God's idol lost by their touch. That cannot be proven by building a separate temple. It is necessary for the untouchables to demand worshipping the same idol which the touchables consider sanctum sanctorum, without which the untouchables cannot establish equality. Interesting thing here is now the tension between religion and freedom. Because Ambedkar would want separate electorates just 5 years later. And it is here that he, perhaps anticipating that turn, says it is not the separation of the temple. That is, so we see these two coming to religion and freedom to be the central motive, perhaps the central struggle in Ambedkar. We say God's sanctity is lost only by the touch of sinners, not by our touch. We are not sinners. The principle of our movement is that nobody